Well, hello, leaders. I hope that you all are doing well this week. Hey, we have a really interesting passage for you guys coming up on Sunday. We are in Genesis 32, looking at verses 22 through the end of the chapter. So, this is a passage. The story is something we've probably heard about before. The people in your class are somewhat familiar with the events that take place, but not necessarily the significance that they bear. And there's a lot of misunderstandings around this particular passage. And so as we're about to dive in, let's just kind of set up the story, because once again, the study of Genesis has to be done chronologically. I mean, the book of Genesis is intentionally written as a story by Moses to communicate to the people of Israel who they are. And so every passage has to be read and understood in line with the story. And so we've already looked at the Abraham and the promise that God has made to him. And now we're tracking the family line of Abraham and seeing how God fulfills that promise to bless him, to make his people into a mighty nation, and ultimately to bless the whole world through his offspring, which is going to be the big resolution to the sin problem that the serpent brought about all the way back in Genesis 3. So we're following his family line. We're seeing God fulfill his covenants. We've seen God do that through Abraham, through Isaac, and now we've been in the last few weeks looking at the story of Jacob. Now, just like his forefathers, Jacob is a guy that's kind of hard to like. Jacob is a guy who is full of flaws, right? We know from the very beginning, we see story after story of him being sneaky and deceitful. He's born grasping his brother's heel, this euphemism for being a deceiver and a trickster. His name's Jacob, which literally means a deceiver, a liar. Right? We see him steal the birthright by tricking his blind father. We see him taking advantage of his starving brother, to all of these things that we've seen take place that set up the character of Jacob. But here in this passage today, we witness a real turning point in his life. I would argue that this story that we're about to witness, where Jacob wrestles with God, and we'll talk more about it actually being God here in a second, it is his equivalent to Abraham's having to sacrifice his son Isaac. This is kind of that test, that moment in his life that changed things forever. We saw Abraham being a guy who really struggled to let go and give up and trust God with the things that he had given him, right? Instead of trusting God to protect his wife, he tried to lie and pretend like she was his sister, right? He didn't want to give up his son. He didn't trust God to provide a son, and so he went his own way with Hagar. Like, we see all of these examples where Abraham doesn't trust God to take care of the things that he's given Abraham. Much of the same way, Jacob's fatal flaw is he likes to go about things his way. I'm sure there's none of us that will be able to relate to that. But Jacob, he sees what he wants, and instead of trusting God to do it in his time and his way, he decides he's going to do it his way and make sure it happens, regardless if that way never, necessarily honors the Lord. First and foremost example of that is lying to his father and trying to steal the blessing that he would have known was already coming. But rather than trusting God to give it to him in his time, Jacob goes about it his way. And so really, in this story, God is challenging Jacob to let go of his greatest tendency, just as he did with Abraham. Now, to kind of set up the story, we need to look at just a few verses before this prayer that Jacob issues to God. If you don't know where we're at, Jacob's about to return to his fatherland, and there Esau is waiting, and Esau has held on to this resentment towards his brother Jacob for essentially ruining his life. And so Jacob knows Esau wants him dead, and he is dreading going back and meeting him. And so he is scared, he is desperate, he is worried, and kind of at the end of himself, he comes to God and he says this prayer beginning in verse 9 of our chapter, Genesis 32. He says, "O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the deeds of steadfast love and of all the faithfulness that you have shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I have become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. And so Jacob's at this point where he realizes, I can't do this one by myself. God, I am desperate for your help and your intervention. And his answer really comes in an unexpected way as we get to our passage. So beginning in verse 32, it says as follows. We're just going to walk through this, going to point out a couple of interesting things to you guys and leave you to it. That same night after he has prayed, he's about to go back to see Esau. He arose and took his wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 children, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. And he took them and sent them across the stream and everything else that he had. And Jacob was left alone. And a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And the man saw he did not prevail against Jacob. He touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, Let me go, for the day has broken. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And he said, What's your name? And he said, Jacob. Then he said, You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. Then Jacob answered, Please tell me your name. But he said, Why is it that you ask my name? And there he blessed them. So Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, saying, For I have seen God face to face, and yet my life has been delivered. And he rose up, going from there, limping because of his hip. So a couple of things I just want to kind of help you guys see as you teach this morning. First and foremost, who is this man? This instance kind of seems out of the blue that he goes from prayer. Next thing you know, there's a man who just starts fighting him. I mean, who is he supposed to be? The story makes extra careful to point out that Jacob is left all by himself, so this couldn't possibly anyone from his party or his camp. But we'll just cut to the chase. This isn't a man, and this isn't an angel. This is God. This is absolutely God in the flesh, meaning I think it's very clear from the text that this is a pre-incarnate Jesus appearing to Jacob here. Now, a couple reasons why we think this. Number one, he mentions towards the end of this passage that he has seen God face to face, and yet his life has been delivered. So Jacob himself believed that this was God he was interacting with. Second, Hosea 12 actually describes this interaction, writing in verses 3 through 5. Jacob, in the womb, he took his brother by the heel, but in his manhood he strove with God. He strove with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He met God at Bethel, and there God spoke with us, the Lord, the God of hosts. So I think it's pretty clear that this is an example of what we call a Christophany. That is a Old Testament appearance of the person of Jesus Christ. Now, there's a few points throughout the Old Testament where we see this taking place. I think Abraham and Sarah, where these 3 mysterious visitors appear. One of them is God in the form of a man, which would be Jesus. We see this case here. We see with Gideon, the angel of the Lord, who as he is worshipped, does not refuse the worship of Gideon, but receives it, clearly indicating that this is in fact God. And so what I think is important about this is, one, it's just interesting, but more importantly, this really tells us something about the nature of Christ. Some have this idea that Jesus didn't exist until he was born to the Virgin Mary, but that couldn't be any further from the truth. Jesus is eternal. He is eternally the Son. He was there with God at creation, taking part in creation, and so it makes perfect sense that he would appear throughout the Old Testament because he is working alongside the Father all throughout this time. Next question as we work through this, does Jacob win this fight? I mean, it almost appears as you're reading that Jacob beats Jesus in a wrestling match, and that doesn't seem right. So, did he really win? Well, yes and no. And by no, I mean there was never any point where Jesus was going to lose this wrestling match. I think that's the whole purpose whenever he just touches his hip and puts it out of place, to show that at any second he could have overpowered him and dropped him without any effort at all. But Jacob is victorious in a different way. He's victorious in that he prevails. Now, this wrestling match I don't think is as much about physical strength as it is desperation of the will of Jacob. Now, you have to understand, tomorrow, this is nighttime, and in the morning he is going to meet Esau. And in his mind, there is a very probable chance that him and his entire family are going to be murdered. So this guy is at the end of himself. He has gone before God in prayer. He is desperate, and really, for the first time in his life, all of his deceitful plans and his schemes are not going to get him out of this one. He has no other options. But as he encounters the person of Jesus, he realizes, oh my goodness, I'm in the presence of God. He clings to him desperately. He refuses to let go because he knows the only hope he has of survival is if God blesses him by his grace. That's why Hosea describes this interaction as a striving, that he was weeping, seeking his favor. And so this blessing is really just an act of mercy on Jesus's part. He's at the end of himself. And I think there's a lot of beauty to be pulled from that, a lot of lessons to be learned from that whenever we come before God in prayer. Do we come to God with our schemes, trying to get him to bless our pre-made plans, or are we desperate for his help and his power? Because that is where the hope really comes. Third and finally, a new name. We see God asks Jacob what his name is as Jacob is seeking this blessing, almost forcing Jacob to communicate his name, knowing good and well that it means that he is a deceiver. And yet God essentially says this isn't who you are anymore. He changes his name to Israel, which means God prevails. Now, this is kind of a fun play on words, as Jacob had prevailed with God, so his name becomes a reminder that God is ultimately the one who prevails. But here's what's important. It's important that you show your class that this is Jacob being named Israel, and that name Israel, which we associate for the rest of the Old Testament with the people of God, is ultimately a family name. And so as we track the people of Israel, we are tracking Jacob's descendants, ultimately the descendants of Abraham, and tracking how God fulfills his promises throughout the Old Testament. So I hope these were a few pieces of information that are helpful to you guys. I'm praying for you all as you all prepare. I hope that you have a great lesson. We'll see you Sunday.